This is the podcast for Memory, Chapter 6, Learning Objectives. So for this chapter, we'll be starting with covering different theories of how memory is formed. So we have the Atkinson-Shiffrin three-stage processing model of memory and how we process memories in three distinct stages, and it gets into how we conceptualize working memory, which is sort of like where all of the work is done in terms of the nuts and bolts of processing memory, and that typically transfers then over to what we think of as short-term memory. Things that we don't store for the long haul in our brain, and we use it for a period of time when we need it, and as soon as we don't need it anymore, our brain gets rid of it. It's shifted. If we need to store it for longer, it moves into long-term memory. Describe the types of information that we encode automatically. So you'll learn about encoding, which is basically the inputting of information into your brain. What do we sort of automatically just transfer into our brain in units, I guess, that our brain can understand, versus what does it take effort to process? So some things take effort, right? You don't automatically encode how to ride a bike or how to tie your shoes or what the capitals of every states are. You have to memorize those things. It takes effort. So that kind of compare and contrast the processing that takes effort versus the processing that's automatic, and being able to understand examples of each. And we'll look at comparing the benefits of visual, acoustic, and semantic encoding. So units that our brain recognizes that are visual elements, as well as what we hear acoustically, and then that which we give meaning to, semantic encoding. And these are the ways in which we remember verbal information, basically. So be able to and also what are some strategies for enhancing encoding, getting information into the brain? What are some strategies for that? And this is a really interesting chapter because basically when you're doing that, you're getting better at encoding, which will hopefully help you in terms of studying for tests. So take a look at those various methods, and then contrast two types of sensory memory. Sensory memory is the very first stage of memory, and take a look at what kinds of things we use for sensory memory versus then the duration and capacity of working or short-term memory. So working memory is just, if we look back up here, just that process that occurs in short-term memory. We call it working memory because it's kind of where all the work happens, of like the brain figuring out what am I going to hold on to that I might need later, what do I only need to know for right now, and what can I kind of get rid of. We think of the brain as sort of a computer, right? It doesn't have a limitless capacity. It can hold and store a lot of data, but there's limits, right? So our brain kind of gets rid of that which it doesn't think it's going to need, and holds on to that which it thinks it does, or that which we give effort to, trying to remember for a longer time. So basically, being able to understand that and describing then what happens when it does go over to long-term memory, so the capacity and the duration of long-term memory. There's some biological changes that happen as we form memories and we store them, especially for that long-term capacity. Okay? Then we'll look at a couple different types of memory, implicit and explicit memories, distinguishing between the two and being able to identify what areas of the brain we're using when we are using implicit memories or explicit memories. So here's where we get into information about the type of memory we store, whether it be a childhood memory for, say, the first teacher you ever had in school, or your best friend growing up versus how to tie your shoe or how to ride a bike. There are different types of memories that happen. Some of those are more procedural. We learn as we do. Some are more explicit. We learn as we say, or the more we practice saying, rote memorization, right? So those are kind of what's involved there, and there's different parts of the brain that we're using when we access those different kinds of memories. So a memory for riding a bike is not stored in the same place in the brain as would the memory for the names of your relatives. Okay, and this is why we start to see some problems later in memory with people who suffer from Alzheimer's, losing and forgetting certain kinds of memories. So we'll take a look at that as well. Then describing the impact of environmental contexts. So the environment that you're in and how that can affect how you store or process memories, as well as your internal emotional state and how that affects retrieval of memories. You know, whether you're in a good mood or a bad mood, when you're trying to retrieve a memory, it is affected by what kind of mood you were in when you stored that memory. So we'll look at some of those context-specific and memory-dependent memories. Also explain why we should value our ability to forget and discuss the roles of encoding failure and storage decay in the process of forgetting. So here's the forgetting part of memory. What happens when we forget? Why do we forget? What's going on in the brain when we can't remember something? Is it that we didn't store correctly to begin with? Or is it that we didn't use it enough, so our brain let go of it? And the answer to that is multifaceted, right? So it's kind of all of the above. But you'll be able to distinguish and explain the differences in what happens when we forget. So that's going to involve retrieval failure, the inability to get out something that you have stored in your brain, right? And that's the kind of the key thing everybody wishes they could figure out. I know I studied those words, but I just can't. I'm taking my tests and I just can't remember them, right? And then discuss how things can get in the way of that. So the effects of interference and motivated forgetting on retrieval. Sometimes we are motivated to forget something. We want to forget something, be it emotional or be it something that wasn't important to us. And then sometimes things can just get in the way. We learn something, then we learn something else, and our brain hangs on to the more recent thing and forgets the thing that came before it. And so that can affect how we grab out those memories. Then we'll take a look at how misinformation, imagination, and source amnesia can distort our memory of an event. We have a memory for something that happened, an event, and other things can kind of leak in and get into that memory and change the way we stored it. Can change the makeup of that memory. We can add details as time goes by. Somebody might say something that's similar to the memory we formed, and then we attach on to what they say, and we add that in to our own memory, even though that's not how it occurred for us or how we remembered it. And then our imaginations can kind of run a little wild. There's a good example of this is if you've ever heard families telling stories. Depending upon the family member telling the story, you might hear it a little different. The details might be a little different. Well, whose story is correct? Chances are they're all correct to a degree. Different people remember different details, or they've been enhanced over time by the retelling of the memory. So sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish between what is a true raw memory and what might be a false memory, a memory that has been enhanced or affected by misinformation. We'll take a look at eyewitness testimony. That's actually going to be the topic of your discussion post this week, particularly child eyewitness reports. They tend to be more reliable because children tend not to let other things affect their memory as much as adults do. But then sometimes if it's something emotional, they might not be as reliable because children might not be able to process their emotions in a way that makes sense as they're retelling an event. And so there could be a little bit of controversy there, especially when dealing with repressed and recovered memories, a memory that a person all of a sudden remembers from when they were young. And a lot of times it involves trauma or abuse or something of that nature, and they just suddenly remember it. Is that true? Can that be true? We'll take a look at some of the work of Elizabeth Loftus, who actually has a wealth of research and data to suggest that it really is not true. And that there's too many things that can get in the way and go wrong when a person suddenly and often under the umbrella of therapy remembers something, uncovers something that they quote unquote forgot. A lot of times people can be coerced into thinking something happened. Ideas can be put in their head just by mere suggestion, not by malice or intent to do harm, but just, something could be suggested, and if a person is highly suggestible, especially under hypnosis, which can often be used during therapy, they might recall and remember events that never actually happened. So there's a lot of controversy there, actually. And then lastly, explain how an understanding of memory can contribute to effective study techniques. And that's kind of where you all want to, perk up your ears and pay attention to, what can you be doing that's been proven through research to enhance study techniques. So that's it for Chapter 6.